A powerful voice steps into the courtroom, confident, sharp, and unshaken. But when a jaw-dropping $200,000 fine is handed down, the room freezes. What follows isn't anger, it's something far more unexpected. A quiet reply so profound, so deeply moving it turns the entire courtroom on its head and leaves even the judge speechless. What was said? And why did it bring tears to the most unlikely eyes? Stay tuned. Because this isn't just a legal battle. It's a moment that no one saw coming. In a courtroom known for its order and seriousness, a moment unfolded that surprised many both inside and outside the legal world. A fine of $200,000 was issued against a well-known public servant. The news spread quickly, sparking discussions, not just among legal experts but also among ordinary people who followed the case closely. This wasn't just another penalty. It carried a weight that made people stop and wonder, why such a large amount? What happened that led to this decision? The fine, announced suddenly, created a wave of confusion, criticism, and concern. The courtroom, once filled with calm, had turned silent when the number was spoken aloud. The decision felt firm, absolute, but it also raised eyebrows. Many questioned whether the fine was just about rules or if there was something deeper behind it. The person fined, known for their voice in public matters, had not broken any criminal law. Yet here they were, facing one of the largest fines ever given to someone in their position under such circumstances. It wasn't long before legal scholars, journalists, and members of the public began analyzing every detail. Observers couldn't help but compare the case with others in the past. In similar cases, fines were usually much lower and involved clear violations of rules or policies. But in this situation, things seemed different. There was no major misconduct, no act of fraud, and no clear explanation that matched the scale of the penalty. The numbers simply didn't add up. Legal experts began speaking out, some saying the fine was legally shaky, while others pointed out that even if technically allowed, it seemed heavy-handed. Outside the courtroom, voices grew, louder. Some people believed the fine was meant to send a message, a warning to others who spoke boldly or questioned powerful systems. If that were true, it raised serious concerns about freedom and fairness. Others believed it was personal, that it wasn't really about rules but about power, control, and influence. The idea that someone could be punished so harshly just for standing firm in their beliefs or challenging the status quo unsettled many. They worried that this wasn't just about one person, but about a trend that could affect others who dared to speak out. As the media picked up the story, the fine became a national topic. Commentators debated it on television, writers published articles, and people online flooded social platforms with opinions. Was this justice or was it intimidation disguised as legal action? The courtroom became a symbol, not just a place where rules were followed, but where fairness itself was being tested. Some felt the fine was a reminder that even in the highest places, decisions could be influenced by emotion, ego, or a desire to control rather than serve justice. Inside legal circles, the case began to be studied as an example of judicial overreach. The amount, $200,000, was not a small mistake or a routine punishment. It represented something bigger. In law, proportionality is important. The punishment must fit the issue. If it doesn't, it can look like revenge instead of justice. Many law professors and former judges weighed in, suggesting that this decision may have crossed that line. They argued that courts should always aim to be above personal feelings and should never use their power to silence or pressure someone unfairly. The person fined did not react right away. This silence only added to the attention. People waited to see what they would say or do next. Would they pay the fine? Would they challenge it? Would they step back quietly? But regardless of the answer, one thing was already clear. The fine had created a moment of national reflection. It wasn't just about money. It was about principles, about power, and about what happens when someone uses the legal system to send a message louder than the law intended. What made this situation even more powerful was that it involved someone who had already built a reputation for standing up for truth and logic. This wasn't a case of someone caught breaking clear rules. This was someone being penalized, many believed, for having the courage to speak, question, and defend their views with confidence. The fine, therefore, wasn't just seen as a financial burden. It was viewed by many as an attack on the very values that keep a legal system fair. Public interest in the case didn't fade quickly. People continued to follow each development. Every new detail sparked more questions. Legal groups began reviewing the judge's past rulings. Activists began calling for clearer rules around how and when large fines can be issued. Some even asked for oversight, worried that without checks, one powerful person could misuse their role without accountability. The courtroom, usually a quiet place of procedure and order, had become the center of one of the year's biggest debates, all because of one decision that many believed went too far. When a fine reaches the amount of $200,000, it naturally draws attention. People start asking questions not just about the amount, but also about the intention behind it. In this case, the size of the fine was more than surprising. It felt excessive to many. It created the impression that something else, something beyond the surface, might be influencing the decision. It wasn't just a legal action. It looked like a message. Many observers and legal experts began to sense that the fine had less to do with rules and more to do with power. The decision didn't seem to follow the usual pattern. In most legal cases, fines are calculated based on the harm caused or the level of wrongdoing. But here, there was no proven damage, no clear act that could justify such a large financial punishment. It felt out of proportion. That led many people to wonder whether the fine was really about justice or if it was about sending a warning. Was this person being made an example of? Was this about silencing a voice that had spoken too boldly, too publicly? Legal scholars weighed in quickly. They reviewed the facts and pointed out that similar cases rarely ended in such high penalties. In fact, most professionals agreed that if there had been a minor error or disagreement in conduct, it would normally result in a warning or a small fine. Nothing close to what was handed down here. This made people think more deeply about motive. If the law didn't clearly support such a fine, then what was the purpose? Theories began to spread. Some suggested it was an effort to break someone's will. Others said it might be an emotional reaction disguised as a legal decision. Those who followed the case closely began to talk about fairness. In any justice system, fairness must be at the center. Every decision should be made based on facts, not feelings. And when a penalty appears unusually harsh, it can damage the public's trust. People begin to think that the system favors power over truth. In this situation, that fear was very real. Many members of the public, including those without legal training, began to ask, why such a large fine? Was it truly about law or was it about control? The idea that someone in a powerful position could use that power to issue a personal punishment troubled many. Even if the rules allow for such a fine, the use of that power must be careful and fair. Otherwise, it becomes punishment without balance. That's dangerous. Not just for the person fined, but for the entire system. It creates an atmosphere where speaking honestly might come with high risk. That's not what justice is supposed to look like. In a healthy legal system, disagreement should be allowed, even encouraged, if it leads to better understanding and stronger outcomes. People began to feel that this fine wasn't just a financial matter, it was symbolic. It represented a moment where authority might have stepped beyond its rightful boundary. The person receiving the fine had not committed fraud, harmed anyone, or broken a major law. Yet the penalty was severe. This raised the idea that the fine wasn't simply a reaction to an action, but a reaction to a person who had likely challenged something or someone too boldly. That's what made the situation different. It made people uncomfortable, because it suggested that justice could be influenced by ego or emotion. The reaction outside the courtroom confirmed how unusual the decision was. Journalists covered the story closely, legal experts debated its fairness, and people from all sides of the political and legal world shared their opinions. Many found it hard to believe that such a fine could be given without more serious cause. Even those who didn't always agree with the person being fined spoke up. They understood that this wasn't about agreement. It was about the principle of fair treatment. If this could happen to someone with a public platform and legal knowledge, what could happen to someone without those protections? Across the country, legal observers began reviewing the structure of how fines are issued in cases like this. They called for transparency and checks to ensure no one person could impose such a fine without oversight. Some asked whether the existing rules were strong enough to protect individuals from personal targeting. It became a broader discussion, one that went beyond the original case. People realized that while rules are important, the people who apply them must also be guided by ethics and fairness. This entire situation became more than just a headline. It turned into a question of how much power is too much. If someone in authority can deliver such a harsh punishment without solid public reasoning, then the system itself comes under pressure. That's why so many people began to ask, not just, what happened, but why did it happen? The fine was real, but the concern went deeper. It touched on the balance between authority and accountability, and whether justice was truly being served. When someone faces a penalty as large as $200,000, most people would expect a strong emotional reaction, maybe shock, anger, or even fear. It is not every day that someone is told they owe that much money, especially in such a public and high-pressure setting. But what happened instead was something that changed the entire tone of the courtroom. There was no panic, no shouting, and no signs of frustration. The person who received the fine remained calm and composed, which surprised everyone watching. What made the moment stand out even more was not just the silence, but what followed. A carefully thought-out response began to unfold, not rushed or reactive, but intelligent and deliberate. The words chosen were clear, respectful, and backed by solid legal understanding. Instead of matching pressure with pressure, the reply used logic to cut through the situation. This approach wasn't just powerful, it was educational. It reminded everyone in the room that the law is not about who speaks louder, but who speaks with truth and reason. The response started by questioning the legal foundation of the fine itself. Not in a disrespectful way, but in a way that made people think. The fine had been delivered as if it were unquestionable, as though no one would dare to challenge it. But with just a few carefully selected words, that sense of certainty began to fade. The points raised weren't about emotion. They were about the rules, the facts, and the process. That's where real strength in legal matters lies. What followed was a brief but powerful explanation of why the fine seemed out of place. It focused on principles, on how penalties should match the issue and should never be used to intimidate or silence. It mentioned how the justice system is supposed to protect people, not punish them unfairly for their voice. These words were not only heard, they were felt. The courtroom grew more silent with each passing sentence. Listeners, including legal, experts, and ordinary observers, began to nod quietly, realizing that something important was happening. Instead of reacting emotionally, the response highlighted how the law works. It reminded everyone that legal action must have clear reasoning, that decisions must be fair, and that rules must apply to all, not just those with less power. It wasn't about avoiding responsibility. It was about holding the system accountable to its own standards. That is what made the reply so unique. It turned the attention away from the fine itself and toward the values behind the legal system. The strategy used in the reply showed deep understanding of how power can sometimes be misused. Without naming names or making personal attacks, the reply made a strong case that fairness had not been followed. It used examples from previous cases, mentioned relevant legal standards, and connected everything in a way that made even those in authority stop and think. The person speaking wasn't just defending themselves. They were teaching a lesson about justice and dignity. The power of the response wasn't just in the words, but in the delivery. Calm, steady, and unshaken, the reply showed that real strength often comes in quiet moments. People in the room felt the weight of what was being said, not because it was loud, but because it was honest. The reply didn't seek sympathy. It didn't ask for pity. Instead, it stood tall on the foundation of logic and fairness, showing that even in the face of great pressure, Truth doesn't need to shout to be heard. What this moment taught observers was something important about how courage looks in a courtroom. It is not always about bold gestures or dramatic actions. Sometimes courage is in speaking clearly when it would be easier to stay silent. Sometimes it is in asking questions that others are afraid to ask. And sometimes it is in knowing the law so well that even those who try to misuse it have to pause and listen. The unexpected nature of the reply had an effect no one could ignore. It shifted the focus away from the fine and toward the bigger picture. It made people question not just the decision, but the process that led to it. And above all, it reminded everyone watching that the true purpose of law is not to create fear, but to ensure fairness. When someone responds not with anger, but with informed resistance, it sends a message louder than any outburst ever could. That's what made this moment so powerful and unforgettable. The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted the moment the response to the fine began. What had started as a routine legal proceeding suddenly took on a deeper meaning. Everyone expected resistance, maybe even frustration or defiance. But instead, the reply was something no one saw coming, humble, wise, and full of moral clarity. It was not loud or dramatic. It was quiet and calm, but it carried the kind of strength that made people stop and listen. This was not about arguing. It was about standing firm in truth without raising one's voice. What made the reply so powerful was not just the legal knowledge it showed, but the personal values behind it. It began by recognizing the seriousness of the situation. There was no attempt to dodge responsibility or make excuses. The tone was respectful, even toward the very authority that had delivered such a harsh penalty. But that respect didn't mean silence. It was paired with clear questions, thoughtful reflections, and a deep understanding of fairness. These were not words thrown in anger. They were words chosen with care, each one carrying a purpose. There was a clear message that the fine was not only excessive but also unfair in the way it was delivered. The reply carefully pointed out that penalties should never be used to send personal messages or silence someone's voice. The law is meant to be a shield for justice, not a weapon for control. When punishments become personal, they lose their meaning. They stop being about justice and start being about power. And that's when the system starts to crack. The reply touched on that idea in a way that was both honest and deeply moving. Instead of focusing only on the money, it talked about what the fine represented. It questioned why such a large penalty was given when there had been no harm done, no law clearly broken in a serious way. It reminded everyone in the room that punishment should always be balanced with purpose. Without fairness, even the right, tools of the law can be used in the wrong way. What made this even more impactful was the emotional control shown during the response. There was no attempt to win the room with emotions. Instead, it was the calmness that carried the weight. It takes strength to stay composed in the face of what feels like injustice. It takes even more strength to speak in a way that opens people's minds instead of shutting them down. That's what happened in that moment. People who may not have fully understood the background began to feel that something wasn't right, not because they were told, but because they could sense it in the truth of the words. Observers could see the effect right away. The courtroom, which had been filled with tension and confidence from the other side, suddenly grew quiet. People were no longer focused on the fine itself. They were now listening to a person who refused to let that fine define her. The reply made it clear that no amount of money could buy silence, and no punishment could erase the truth. That kind of inner strength is rare. It doesn't come from books or titles. It comes from knowing who you are and standing by your values. Legal professionals who were present later admitted that they didn't expect such a powerful comeback. They were used to legal defenses that leaned on technicalities or arguments. But this was something different. It was a lesson in integrity. It was about using the law not as a shield, but as a light, to show what justice really looks like when it's practiced with honesty. Many said they left that courtroom not just with opinions, but with questions. Questions about how justice should be done, and how much of it depends on the people who speak up when it matters most. This was a turning point. not just in one case, but in how many people saw the relationship between power and fairness. The reply reminded everyone that the courtroom is not only a place for rules, it's a place for principles. And sometimes, it only takes one person with courage and clarity to remind a system of what it was built to protect. That is what happened, in that moment. The fine, though large, became small in the shadow of such strength. And the message was clear. No matter how big the penalty, it cannot silence a voice rooted in truth. Sometimes the most powerful lessons in a courtroom don't come from judges or lawyers. They come from how someone reacts when they are treated unfairly. In this situation, after a heavy fine of $200,000 was issued, many assumed the story would end with financial hardship or a silent retreat. But what happened next was a reminder that true dignity doesn't fold under pressure. It rises, and in doing so, it teaches everyone in the room a valuable lesson. The person who received the fine didn't crumble. Instead, they spoke in a way that was calm but deeply moving. The response didn't focus on anger or revenge. It didn't aim to embarrass anyone. It aimed to show that there's a better way to lead, with grace, wisdom, and courage. The words used were full of meaning. They asked no favors. They carried no bitterness. They were simply honest, showing the truth without shouting it. The courtroom, once filled with judgment and tension, began to shift. People started noticing how the words weren't just about the fine, they were about justice, fairness, and what it means to truly serve the law. The message was clear. Punishment cannot replace respect, and authority must always be balanced with responsibility. This wasn't just a statement, it was a quiet protest against what felt like an unfair decision. Yet it was done with respect. That balance between standing firm and staying composed is what left the deepest impression. One of the most striking parts of the response was how it moved from personal experience to universal principles. Instead of just saying, "This is unfair to me," it asked, "What does this mean for others who don't have a voice?" That kind of thinking shows leadership. It takes a strong person to face injustice. It takes an even stronger one to think about the bigger picture in the middle of it. The fine, which was meant to silence, ended up being the reason for an even louder message, one about the power of staying true to your values. Observers in the room were visibly affected. Some, who had come in with one opinion, began to shift. They realized that justice isn't just about rules written on paper. It's also about how those rules are used. When they are used to punish unfairly, especially someone who speaks truth to power, they lose their meaning. But when someone challenges them calmly and with knowledge, it reminds everyone what the law is truly for. That's what happened here. The lesson didn't come from shouting or arguing. It came from quiet strength. The person facing the fine used this moment to show that the law can still be beautiful when used the right way. They spoke of justice not as a tool for control, but as a promise to protect. This wasn't just about money. It was about principle. And because they spoke from the heart, backed by knowledge and experience, their words hit deeper than any legal argument ever could. The courtroom became a place of reflection, not just judgment. There was something deeply human in the way the reply was delivered. It didn't try to hide emotion, but it didn't let emotion control the message either. It reminded people that the strongest voices are often the ones that don't rise in volume but in wisdom. It takes real strength to face down power with peace. And it takes real knowledge to do so in a way that makes people stop and question what they thought they knew. Even those who had supported the decision to fine began to see things differently. When truth is spoken clearly, it can pierce even the hardest walls. And when someone keeps their dignity while being treated unfairly, it shows everyone watching that character matters more than control. That's what stood out most in the courtroom that day. It wasn't just about what was said. It was about how it was said. Calmly, clearly, and with a purpose that reached beyond the moment. People left that courtroom not just remembering the fine, but remembering the reply. They talked about how someone took a hard situation and turned it into a moment of teaching and truth. They spoke of courage, not in loud protests, but in steady resolve. That moment will be remembered not because of the penalty, but because of how it was faced with grace, with truth, and with a kind of quiet power that no money could ever take away.